Okay, I'm Alexander James. Hi. I'm teaching the alternative debate styles, which is basically just going to be non-traditional debate, if it works. I should say, as a heads up, I don't believe in the banking concept of education, which means if we could have a dialogue, that'd be baller. If I ask questions, it's not to get some trick question out of you. I just really like having the discussion. And that's what a lot of this lecture is going to be. It's just discussions about what you think debate is, what I think debate is, how we can reconcile those differences if they even exist. They probably don't. All right. So I think a fundamental question as debaters is that we have to understand is what debate means to us. So the majority of debate I think people have seen has been policy debate as far as defending a fiat policy option by the US federal government to solve something caused in the status quo. Has anyone seen anything especially different than that? That's basic fundamental assumption, right? So within that also is discussions of what should be allowed in debate. And here's where a lot of it comes into issues of how you deal with debate being competition as opposed to content that may not be competitive. So as we'll talk about, this will all make sense basically throughout the round, or throughout the throughout the lecture. But basically, how do you reconcile things like poetry, things like performance that don't necessarily have a competitive element in an event that is specifically competitive? And that, I feel like, basically comes down to the basic requirements for debate. So I think there are three elements that you need on app and neg, no matter who you are. You need to have a framework that explains how you see the round. Whether that's net benefits as defined by the role of the policymaker, doing fiat policy option by the man, or if that's using linguistics as political resistance, whether that's the best methodology for the liberation of the oppressed, whether that's our individual relationship with the environment, whether that is any number of different ways that the judge can understand us as competitors within this event. So that's why framework matters. Framework basically allows you to change the question that's being asked. Instead of should the government do X, it's is the AF a good idea? And how does the AF understand these particular issues? You also need a role of the ballot, or an advocacy. And here's some cool debate that I think kind of gets underlooked as far as what the role of the judge is and how the judge writes their ballot. I don't know. I think it's cool when people talk about arguments about you as a judge particularly should use your space or use your not privilege but use your power as a judge specifically to do something, as in you are writing a written summary of this round, which means you have the ability to frame what's happening in a specific way. So issues sort of in the demo debate, the Mark Shaw we read was your role is of a dialectical materialist, and talking about dialectical materialism and things like that, or other people inhabit the role of a historian, or inhabit the role of, a lot of times in logical con debates, of the analyst. And then you get into issues of how to use psychoanalysis as the judge, as an analyst in that particular space. Or you need at least an advocacy, whether that's the United States federal government doing something, or whether that's your alternative. You basically need to be able to explain why voting for you, what voting for you is. And the last thing you need is a reason to vote for you. This seems all pretty intuitive, pretty simple day one shit, but I think the biggest problem within performance debate, within non-traditional debate in general that I've ever seen, is that people don't view it just as debate. That it's seen as, they just read their hippie shit, or they just danced around the room, or they did this, and it's these goddamn hippies, right? But it's still an argument. It has a framework that explains how you see the round. It has their advocacy, it explains what the ballot does, and there's a reason to vote for it. There is no difference between reading Eve Ensler and reading Nate Silver polls, right? There's no fundamental difference between reading excerpts from the Vagina Monologues and reading excerpts from, CNN. The only difference in the way you deal with that content is, the only difference in the way that content is used is the way you deal with it. So whether you put it through a perspective that's specifically policy-based, or you put it through like a poetic framing. Does that all make sense? What's the craziest shit you've ever seen? And don't be afraid, because I've probably gone to that far extent myself.
I guess one of the things I've seen, like, I never got to really being around at the women's wing last year where they were reading like an individual's narrative, but like we did kind of become aware of some of maybe the things that were missing within those arguments that kind of made the rounds difficult to tabulate, right? Kind of the advocacy of like no one should win this round. Well, like how does that work with tab software and how the debate tournament continues? But I think there are ways to make these perfs.
Here's the center point in that competition, which is how do you fit something non-competitive within a competitive framing? And I think there's, I don't know. I mean, I've always, like, my heart's always been on the side of like fuck competition. Like, there's ways of just like you can choose to just vote for one team, and that's a good idea to use your agency outside of a competitive net benefit calculus. But at the same time, I feel like there's also something to be said for like debate is a game, and that game has to have at least some basic rules, and those are you have to disagree with each other. So it's one of those just like, yeah, I mean, allow that, but at the same time, sometimes that may not be applicable, but at the same time, don't be a fascist about it. Be like, no debate for you.
Sure.
So I don't really know how to reconcile that, but yeah.
I think like, it was just more of like, judges weren't really sure how they should respond.
Yeah.
And that, you know, like, I guess maybe finding ways so you're not kind of backing your judge into a very awkward corner. Like, so they can still interact with you.
Anything else you've seen?
A few of us do conformity, and then by the time we got to, we were on the next, so by the time we got to the block, we just broke down the fact that like two people had to speak, but instead we spoke at the same time as if it was a dialogue.
I saw Kale dance the robot and say that fixed transhumanism, transhumanism, which was fascinating. And then I got glitter bombed once, which was great. Really offensive.
Anything else?
Corey and I hit this app where they just read things, like they said like little facts or stories throughout the whole PMC, and then read a tiny bit of framework, and then in the MG they explained how all of that made sense, and we were like,
Was it
we were
Ruben
talking
Maka?
about that like 8 minutes ago?
Is it Ruben Maka?
No. You remember?
I still don't remember what it
It was, I think it was a team from like somewhere in Colorado, I think.
The Rhizome argument?
No, it was like some kind of like Buddhism critique, but they just read a whole bunch of frontlines to shit that you would say to Buddhism without explaining how they applied, and then after you made the arguments, they were like, oh, we already answered this, we were talking about
You did it,
these
bro.
there,
You
remember?
did. Yeah, so there's all sorts of different ones. Like, if you want more stories, you can probably talk to me. I've done some shit. Some irony, some poetry, some monologues, some dancing, some topless protesting, just all the bullshit. Here is, I think, a list of stuff I wrote up of the different ways debate can be performed. And as a heads up, like, critical debate is probably all about transcending those dualities, so there's definitely going to be overlap in all of these. But here are the kind of the differences I tried to isolate. So with the first one, I think it's important to distinguish that hip-hop, poetry, spoken word, and rhythmic language are all unique, and they all come from unique places. Hip-hop and poetry might be the two that are most similar, I think, because hip-hop is poetry, but there's also political aspects of hip-hop that not all poetry has, depending on what poet. Spoken word is also written a different way, a different specific delivery, and then rhythmic language also. So when you're dealing with like, you can probably see there's different types of performances in the very way that you're presenting them. Sometimes you will still be speaking, and sometimes, like, for a lot of them, it just comes down to the way you speak and what words you use, whether you form those words within, like, a poem, or whether you form those words within, like, a narrative, or even, like, monologues or things like that. But there's also a lot about mixing the words you use and also the bodily performance that is in the round. So something like, even just all the stuff about protest, very much involves what the debaters do, whether it's like using your body as an occupation, something we did for like Occupy Wall Street type arguments, of just like occupying the debate space, dancing, things like that. Arguments based off of, like when we did that, it was the same day as the Billion Rising, which if you don't know about that, you should. So the worldwide campaign to use dancing as a way to reclaim the body against violence, particularly the female body, but not exclusively. And so that included not just the words we used, but the way we presented it. And there are also different performances like music, like satire, like there's basically whatever you want to do, you can. And again, it all comes down to the three things that define an argument. The framework that lets you explain how you're able to access the round, the role of the ballot or the advocacy that explains why, like what voting for you is, and the reason to vote for you. Any questions about this? Okay, let's get into some examples. I've always thought this would be a sick performance. One day I hope someone reads it. But this could be a very good example of like both your partner and yourself performing with each other. If you know, this will all make sense.
I heard this was about the financial support your government receives from the drug industry. Well, the irony of this, of course, is that this money, which is in the billions, is coming from your country. You see, you are the major purchaser of our national product, which is, of course, cocaine.
On one hand, you're saying the United States government is spending millions of dollars to eliminate the flow of drugs onto our streets. At the same time, we are doing business with the very same government that is flooding our streets with cocaine.
Let me show you a few of the other characters that are involved in this tragic comedy.
I'm on the border of Bolivia, working for pennies, treated like a slave. The coca fields have to be ready. The spirit of my people is starving, broken and sweaty, dreaming about revolution, looking at my machete. But the workload is too heavy to rise up in arms. And if I ran away, I know they'd probably murder my moms. So I pray to Jesucristo when I go to the mission, process the cocaine paste and play my position.
Okay, listen, while I'm out there, just get me my product before we chop off your hands for workers' misconduct. I got the power to shoot a copper and not get charged. And it would be sad to see your family in front of a firing squad. So to feed your kids, I need these bricks. 40 tons in total, let me test it indeed. Shit, this is good. Pass me a tissue and don't worry about them. I paid off their fee.
Yo, it don't come as a challenge. I'm the son of some of the foulest, elected by my people. The only one on the ballot, born and bred to console with feds. I laugh at fate and assassinate my predecessor to have his place in a third world fashion state. Lock the nation with 90% of the wealth and 10% of the population. A Central Intelligence Agency takes weight faithfully. The finest type of China, white and cocaine, you'll see.
Honey, I'm home. Never mind when your bank account suddenly grown. It's funny, we're so out of this debt for this money we owe with ya. What have I told you that I had two governments overthrown to keep our son enrolled in a private school to keep our tummy swollen? Come on, our fucking home was built on a foundation of bloody throats, the hungry stolen of their souls. Of course this country's running coke. I took a stunning oath to hush the ones who know. The CIA conducts the flow for these young hustlers that lust for dough.
Work in the hood, hit my connect. That's what's really good. It's supply work to the hood. These dudes fucking crack me up. Scrutinize like we inferior. Petrified when we be in my area. I'm gonna shoot till I say so.
Niggas and tapping phones, debating snitches and cracking codes. Fast to cuff or blast the foe on any hustler stacking dough. This pump and crack a blow. And my overtime is where your taxes go. Or gain your trust, get you to hand wait to us. Cause we paid up front on the low with cameras taping you. Getting pop away, the prison sentence is due. Make the collar and leave with 2 keys
Out the evidence room with my fame. Truck, boat, or plane, they watching you. You think you got work? They copping too. We control blocks. They lock countries and own companies. We had nice cars and sneaker money. Now it's players out there talking about they hoping. But boats in their house like they down south with windows open. Window ain't long. You wrong, you take shorts and soon. Feathers be up in your mouth like forks and spoons. So enjoy the rush. Live plush on coke brand. Soon you'll be in the cell with me like Jenny Lopez. In the school I was a bully. Now life is fully a joke. I keep afloat on the boat for Peruvian coke. Players do favors for governors and tax makers. Fat Quakers smoke crack and sex acts with bad mayors. The walls got ears. You big mouths probably scared. Not prepared to do years like Javier.
The story just told is an example of the path that drugs take on their way to every neighborhood in every state in this country. It's a lot deeper than the niggas on your block. So when they point the finger at you, brother man, this is what you gotta tell them.
Okay. So, that song is a 4-minute genealogy of the life of drugs in America, as far as going from the people in Peru picking the coca plants to the person in jail, and the similarities behind the first person and the last person. Maybe we'll do this as a performance, but I've always thought this would just be a fucking fantastic performance for the drug war, because the way it relies on the characters and the lyrics, you have the worker, you have the Peruvian, the person that runs the drug, person that runs coke right there. Person that runs coke, person the leader of Peru, the distributor in the U.S., the dealer on the street, the undercover cop, the prison inmate. It's the path from the fields, through the CIA, through the U.S. federal government, to the streets, to prison. And I think that's one of the best performances you can use as far as telling a linear story. And also, if you think about it, not very different than a straight up AF, right? A is the uniqueness. Here's techniques verse, right? It's the same content. It's the way you choose to present it. And the way this particular one used to present it is through a historical perspective of here's allowing us to trace the path of drugs. Any questions about that? It's pretty sick, right? So, you'd be able to have that in 4 minutes. One day we'll change that fucking rule about no pre-prep material to have a clause for music, but until the fascists are still out of power, we just have to read it on paper. So a 4-minute in that, you have, 3 more minutes in the PMC? So that's 3 minutes of framework, evaluate the surrounding through the lens of whatever, or seek to understand the drug war within a blank perspective, historical perspective, or or even whoever has the best understanding of the process of the drug war or something, right? You need a framework that explains you need to focus on whoever, the person that wins is the person that best creates the best knowledge for understanding the topic, in this case the drug war. And that gets you arguments for all of your gets you in for all of your arguments about creating a holistic understanding using this particular performance and the way that you isolate the workers in Peru and the prisoners in the U.S. as being products of the same system, and why they're both under forms of enslavement is better than just cartels are bad or cocaine addiction's bad, right? Even something like how the CIA introduced crack cocaine to black neighborhoods. thanks Ronald Reagan, like for sure, that happened. But I think an even more holistic understanding can be like, not only did they do that shit, but like, here's how it still happens to be done today. Like, of course this country's running coke. Why wouldn't they? It's profitable. Because if we can run cocaine into the US, then we can spend money fighting that cocaine. And then we all get rich. Any last questions on that? So, I think that would very much fall under a lot of these. Like, I think these three. Maybe some of this. Like, you can't be afraid to take as much as you can out of a specific performance. Like, if a performance has theatrical elements, like, you should talk about why theatrics in debate is good. You should talk about why art in debate is good. And you should isolate which art forms you're talking about. So I want to contrast that with this app that you've probably seen before, but that I think is a very different form of performance and a different form of telling a story, and also a different application of art.
Julie Garland referenced the green farmlands of Kansas when she told audiences that there was no place like home in The Wizard of Oz. But in The Wiz, the yellow brick road was walked by Miss Diana Ross, a Dorothy from the concrete jungle of Harlem, a school teacher who gave back to the community in which she resided, but who was too afraid of leaving home to venture into a world beyond it. Introduced to a Dorothy that never had gone further than 125th Street, we learned that a precondition for truly being a home is the safety we find in those around us, because home is not a place, but rather a structure of support. As Dorothy opens the door to her New York residence to take out the trash after a Thanksgiving dinner, Toto runs headlong into a blizzard that transports the pair to the magical land of Osprey. There are silver slippers snatched from the course of Evermean, the wicked witch of the East, and the magic of the Wiz seem to be her only hope for finding her way back home. Along the journey with the Lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow, the jumble cast of misfits teaches us that no matter where we are going, we can't get there alone. Faced with the yellow brick road lined with a limitless number of off-duty taxi cabs and miles of open road, Dorothy, like the rest of us, gets on down the road on her search to find home place. And just like Dorothy, I was on my journey to find home. The houses that I stayed, the many houses that I resided at were simply just that, houses. I found it hard to find comfort in the battered woman shelter where I knew no one and everyone was scared to speak to the next person, but shockingly enough, I found it hard to find a place of peace and tranquility in the dysfunctional household where crack was being sold out of the dining room window, mice slept with me in the bed, and food was present just as much as my biological father was. Nothing was stable. Nothing was the same. Every day was so different that I never got the time to find a place called home. It wasn't until I found room 131 at Central High School that I started to feel somewhat at home. I say somewhat because I think debate was scary for all of us when we first got here. I mean, giving that first 8-minute speech by yourself is some crazy shit. But after several days of practice and rehearsal with the other students at Central High School, it was time for our first competition, the Central High School Urban Debate League Tournament. All the inner city kids piled into the cafeteria, all very chatty, but just to shake the nerves of the first competition. The thing that eased our minds the most was to know that each and every student was going through a trial of their own. I found new friends, I found family members, and I thought I found a place called home. But after 2 DKC tournaments, Ron Hart thought we were ready for national competition. I'll never forget loading up that bus with the other 3 UDL schools from the district and making our way up 35 North to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Once I arrived and stepped off the bus, I felt a chill. I didn't know if it was because of my uncomfort or just the freezing weather environment. Whatever it was, I knew I had to shake it because it was time. So I grabbed the tub off the bus and followed the rest of the UDL students inside. As we walk into the cafeteria, 250 Caucasian students stop their talking, their movements, their lives, and just stare at us as we walk to the nearest table to put our stuff down. And that was the first sign to me that debate there had to be something totally different. As the rounds and the tournaments and the years went past, I knew I needed to change the space that invited me and so many other students an escape from our households. A point in my career came where I had to put down the revisions to the Patriot Act, the Learning Serve America grants, the subsidies, the pizzas, the democracy assistance, and the energy production, and talk about this community. A lot of bright people get together weekends on end to bounce ideas off of each other's head, but never once do we have conversations about what takes place in cafeterias just like that one, or more importantly, what takes place in actual debates. I found that regardless of the style that I I engaged, style of debate that I engaged in, I could never just be right. There was always a framework that I didn't meet, a way to start my politics off that are no way of evaluating me inside of debate. But I had an epiphany. Just like those students that told me to functionally leave this activity, I have been here just as long as they have. We're all Dorothy's trying to find our home here, but I was never able to have a debate at my house. So if I'm going to do something by the time that this, my last round is over, I'm going to bring the debate back home. Where in 2008 suggests that for young, the proper response is not to reject home, but to extend its positive values to everyone. The idea of home should not be reduced to a mechanism of oppression. Home carries a core positive meaning that should and could be reclaimed. Bell Hooks argues that home is associated with a safety, but she gives a positive and political meaning to the function of home. Home places a site of resistance to dominating and exploiting social structures. The ability to resist dominant social structure requires a space beyond the full reach of those structures where different, more humane social relations can be lived and imagined. A safe home is something that in a just world would be accessible to everyone. Bell Hooks shows how crucial the safety of the home can be as a site of protection from and resistance to oppression. I want to argue for an ideal of home as a site of resistance, a site of risk, of connection, of sustaining relationship through conflict. We can recognize and affirm an ideal of home as a space of mutuality, conflict, of love, and its risks and struggles of caring and conflictual connections to others. In particular, our political homes, including our identity politics, might be seen as a place where we engage in the risk connection with each other, in conflictual, messy, dangerous, intimate work of engagement with each other, engagement in dialogue and arguments and struggles and openness to vulnerability, to critique and to self-critique and to change with a commitment to solidarity with each other that mediates our commitment to our struggles. Shifting to an ideal of home as the space where we risk connection might help us to set clear limits on conflict and risk so that these do not develop into violence. This might enable us to address violence that is a response to the terror and the anger at those who threaten our comfort and safety, and the violence that is an assertion of the right to dominate the other within the walls of the home. If we are not looking for the perfect safety, for an absolute privacy, for a return to the womb, for the mother who is the angel of the house, perhaps we can learn not to accept violence and the oppression as the price of that dream. Perhaps we can imagine and embrace a different dream of a better home. If home is necessary for members of aggrieved communities to find the power to resist, debate precludes the possibility of becoming a site of resistance for those who need it now. Our stylistic norms for engagement are not only inaccessible, but discourage people from even attempting to find a home. It is nearly impossible for disenfranchised individuals who have been trained to believe that they will never succeed to become attached to this activity when they don't feel welcome. Not only are their perspectives dismissed, but they themselves as people are dismissed. We can never have an ethical government official that successfully interacts with communities of color when we train them to forgo a simple hello for the additional 5 seconds of prep. The current focus on the structure of debate and not those individuals who reside here means that the welcoming relationships of home are never present. Also, the form and content of arguments are structured by the politics of displacement that necessitates the search for home in the first place. Debaters have forgone the speech for the speech stock and spew horror stories that train us to be disempowered citizens that never act in the face of actual oppression. Our current model of debate is disconnected from the lived realities of those affected by structural violence. That makes this activity useless to those who need it in terms of oppression and to a gain for those who is already here. Debate should not be a place of politics where we pretend every other aspect of our lives is left behind when we get on the van in the morning, but we should understand for some people the personal is political. What Diana Ross was searching for wasn't just some crammed apartment in New York, but a site of community to mutually recover from the structural violence they witness on a daily basis. In fact, I think that this is the true purpose of energy. When the Dorothy's of the world think of energy, they don't think of thorium reactors, but the energy that is required to get out of bed and navigate the struggle. We get our energy from home, even the workers who run the power plant. So in a sense, all energy finds its origin at home. Instead of energy production, we need to direct our attention to home production. Just like Dorothy and her friends, before we establish answers to larger questions about what happens with the home or what is needed for it, we have to find one. Debate has somewhat been that place for me because I can honestly say I know debate more than anything else. Thus, I think that the role of the ballot in this debate is for the judge to endorse the team that best performatively and methodologically brings debate back home. Brings debate home, not back, sorry. Unlike Dorothy, those excluded voices can't just click their silver slippers and fly away, which is why we use the whiz as a 0 point that informs our political practice and the vision of home. We have to make proactive efforts to be agents of change that ensure that this space and the knowledge produced here is accessible to all that need it. Our methodological engagement starts with just a recognition that, Judy Garland may not have much on the fabulous Diana Ross, but she did have one thing right, and that there is no place like home.
I think that's probably one of the best examples of performance debate. as far as how you perform in a way that is still strategic. I don't remember, I think a lot of people here were at the forum a few nights ago, and we were talking about personal versus strategic. I think it's the best example of why that dichotomy doesn't exist. Because this app is strategic as shit, and it's also extremely personal. Like, the entire last 2 minutes when he was speaking about home production as opposed to energy production. So the topic being, does anyone remember what it was? Like, the US actually should, something about increasing energy production. And like everyone reads thorium reactors and like energy grids and stuff like that. So I think the critical part in this app is when he talks about how energy is not electricity. That there's the energy you need to get out of bed in the morning. And now even the people that work in these energy facilities, or in these energy power plants, still need that. Which means it's a prior question. To you being able to get up out of your bed and have the power to walk to work, or, you know, to travel through the struggle requires that energy. And that energy, as Bellingham talks about the home space, is best accessed through a home. So, any questions before we kind of start analyzing this more? I'm sure most people here have seen this. They won NDT and CETA last year, the first black team to win both. That's tight, with the same app. So in this round, this is an example, I think, of how you can also beat a performative argument. And Wake Forest lost, but like what they went for is arguments. I think they read Bataille cards about home, or not unhome, and why home is a bad concept. And they talked about nomadism and people that don't live in a specific place, and rather their specific place is living nomadically and traveling from place to place. So like the Native American nations that used to live here, a lot of them didn't, or a lot of groups, individuals within those specific nations wouldn't create like, there wouldn't be like borders, right? Like, it wouldn't be like clear delineated nations. Sometimes they did have that element, but not all the time, and especially not in the way that the modern nation states constituted now. So the idea of like a stable home or a stable place is bad. And the argument, the reason that Emporia won is because they talked about how they endorse a type of home, which means that on home is home for you, and that's cool, right? Like, there's more, like, home has a fluid definition, even with the AF, and even with all that said, just because some people don't want a home doesn't mean the AF can't have a home. So it's a reason to go to AF, right? So like, again, what does that get back to? The framework explains how you see the round. The role of the ballot is to vote for the team that best performatively and methodologically brings debate home. Okay. All right, I guess it's the role of the ballot. Framework doesn't really, they don't really read a framework in this one because it's policy, and because you have backside rebuttals, you can sort of just be like, you sort of just go for it. And then when they read framework, which like Northwest did in finals.
Well, part of it too is the assumption that I haven't done anything wrong. I don't have a reason to read framework because I have what
like,
I'm
why
doing
would I
is
read
normal.
policy bad? Of course policy's bad. Like,
yeah. And like, so, and partly I think in the 1AC that's still really strategic to like not read framework, but that's because I like framework debates in the MG. So like, there's a difference there why you don't want to do that in Harvard.
but, so, in any event, they did have framework that explains how they see the round. And in so this is quarters, in finals of NDT, they read this on the AF, and Northwest ran 9 minutes of framework. And like decision making good, like policy making good, all the stuff, just like classic Northwest, or Northwestern, or whatever. And so then it became a framework debate, and it became an issue of like, and that's like, you should definitely check out the NDT 2013 finals round. One of the best 2 ARs, I think, in debate history for like a large amount of time from Emporia. And also just like a perfect example of what happens when you go for framework against a personal narrative that's also strategic. And so, very good performance debate. And then the reason to vote, who wants to shout out what they think the reason to vote for the AF was in that AF?
It was like returning back to this place of home, like creating this home space.
What else?
Well, voting for F explodes the boundaries of who can find the debate space adequate as a home. So
Also
a lot of
true.
people would participate.
That's basically just like the way that it's trying to like transform the incredibly hegemonic white discourse of debate into something that's much more accessible.
What was he talking about as far as the cafeteria?
Sense of alienness.
What?
A sense of alienness, like not being stared at. And so
Yeah.
difference is not being bad or strange.
There's an argument that talks about, I think it was saying that you can't, I don't know if it was a root cause claim or something else, but he was talking about how the bell hooks argument about the best way to challenge oppression is by creating that home space, which means that the creation of a home probably is unintentional into solving pretty much every form of violence, because violence seeks to rip people apart from each other and divide each other, right? Whereas a home space is one that's based upon these interconnections, that's based on that safe place. And I think it's important to note that I don't think he said safe place at all, or safe space, or create a safe space, or rather you typically hear, but rather create a home. Because it's more than just safety from violence, but it's where you can have a place where you can exist with other people and still feel a sense of belonging. Because just being safe just means you're not being attacked. I think that's different than being a place of belonging. And that ultimately is what faith is. And I think that really gets back to like the beginning question of what debate means for us. You know, I mean, I think performance in general asks that question: what is debate? And for many people, debate is how can we solve these big problems that are happening in the status quo using the United States federal government. And we need people like that, for sure. Because unlike our US federal government, at least they're trying to solve things, right? Like, it's probably good for some people, if you want to solve problems, like, word. That's not true of everybody. And performance and non-traditional debate kind of focuses on that, like, what do you do with everyone else? And I think it's simplistic to just say that if you're not solving problems using the United States federal government, then it's not policy making, or it's not a policy action, or it's not decision making. But there is that fundamental question of what debate means. And I think you can probably see that throughout, you know, this entire, like, all these different types of performances, you know.
And like a lot of people are really knee-jerk on those arguments too. They're just gonna say policy's good and then read a bunch of policy good offense. And you're like, no dog, we also have a policy. We just don't use the
And
USFG.
by most people, MAP means 80% of people.
Like, for sure. Just like when you hear people say you have to know the rules of debate before you can debate for a priori, that doesn't mean it comes first. I know your rules. Fuck your rule, it's stupid. Next. So the same thing applies here, is like listening to your opponents and understanding what it is that they're trying to say. Because they're not gonna give you a fair shake if you're running performance. Like, they're gonna shut down and make assumptions. You can't do the same. Like,
Honestly,
you've
like,
gotta be bigger.
performance debate, and the reason that people don't like it, or are against it, or view it as like a sort of just like, okay, you hippies get to have your fun, but like, no, let's have the adults talk, like, is that people just don't understand it. And people get so caught up in what debate is, that when you come at something that's not what debate is, it just like blows their mind.
What it could be. What debate could be is like scary to them.
Right. I remember, did I debate anyone from UNR in LD a few years back when I was playing music?
Wasn't there.
Did I debate you? No, I debated
Yeah,
you
we
part-
did do that, didn't we? No, you right?
Yeah, so like, I debated Nevada, like 30 times in one tournament, because it was at Reno, and ones that are just like flooding the LD pool. And the app I was reading for the agriculture topic was talking about, I read like a critique basically about how US agriculture is based on the assimilation of Native Americans and like the Dawes Act and a bunch of different things that like divested land from tribes and like gave them just like you have to own this property now and things like that, and like all the rhetoric of like agrarian life being bad and like civilized industrial life being good. And then I had an alt about endorsed music as a site of resistance against colonialism, and I played a song by a tribe called Red. Does anyone know who they are?
Yes.
Tribe Called Red are sick. They're 3 like producers and DJs from Ottawa, right? In Canada. And they're all native, and they make like dance music mixed with indigenous music.
Powwow dubstep.
Yeah, it's like powwow step. It's fucking rad. And they made a song called The Road, which they made in solidarity with I Don't Know More, and Chief Spence, is her name? Yeah, okay, so like I Don't Know More is a big indigenous movement in Canada that's fighting for like water rights and things like that. So they made a song in solidarity with them, and so I played that song and just like read some music good cards. And the majority of reactions I got were just like, it's playing music? Fuck, you can do this? Right? And so what are the responses typically, things like that? AZ interpretation, you have to defend if you have a policy option. If it's a violation, you don't. See the standards, predictability. And like, if you want to be a performance debater, the absolute best thing you can ever do in your entire life is have a team read that against you. Because guess what? Most framework is the exact same. And if you have a policy option, like most people just kind of take old policy back files and are just like, what's up? Okay, so you get infinite prep time to write your 2AC answers to that. If someone's reading framework against you, you are in the best spot you can possibly be in, because you will have had time to cut entire answers to that. And that's kind of what happened in that tournament, which is like, okay, let me pull up the 2AC answers to framework, and just like read that straight down. Because again, what is performance debate? Like, it's just a different question. It's the way that you relate to the ballot. It's the way that you relate to the topic. It's the way that you relate to the net benefits to one way or the other. Any questions or feedback or comments or horror stories you want to learn?
Something that I've noticed is that oftentimes teams are so stacked, especially in Parley, right, because you can't bring in pre-prep material, so they'll have like a full like page of just like very thin columns, just like column after column after column of framework answers, and that's their only extensions. Like the MG prep's only that, and that's, I think, maybe a pitfall to be very aware of. That like, yes, it's true that like if they read framework, you're probably gonna have a pretty easy time. But if they happen to engage with you in addition to reading framework, like you could be up shit creek if you're just like the only thing your MG's prepping is like, yeah, we really can't do this.
Yeah.
A good example of this is like McKendry at when they were reading their Hedge Good project, like 4.5 or 5 minutes of that PMC is just like, yeah, we get to do this. That's like framework arguments as opposed to like their.
Yeah, like after this, if you want to talk to like me or Gio or Kate or her partner from UOP, like we had a round a few days ago that was just like that they read poetry from East Germany and talked about traversing borders, and we read like poetry that they read in the high schools in Arizona when they banned the Chicano and Chicano studies, and they started all their classes off with a poem in like 3 different languages, and then we talked about like Chicano spirituality. Right? Like, the worst thing that can ever happen to you is that the other team is like, oh, cool, we're down with that. And here's our performance. Or like, here's why performance is bad. Like in the round, in the Emporia round, I don't remember which, I don't know these people myself, so I'm not sure which of these debaters, but I know, I think it was Ryan, he wrote up a Google Doc and posted it on like the policy Facebook group of just like, hey, everyone's talking about how, I mean, because there's the whole huge racist backlash last year and this year, because for now black teams are winning championships and we can't have that. And a lot of people were just like, how dare you, this is personal, like, you're just going to people feel bad for you, and blah, blah, blah. And so Ryan wrote up a Google Doc of just like, here's how to beat our AF. Like, here are all the problems with it. We're not going to read it again, so here you go. And one of them was The Wiz, the movie that they're using and they're doing a reading of. Black version of The Wizard of Oz, in case you don't know what that is. The protagonist is light-skinned, and the antagonist is dark-skinned. Slayer argument. Slayer. Because if you're talking about using that specific, like, movie as where you're grounding your understanding of home, and the way that's still racialized, and the way that different shades of skin tone, and the way that you assign like life chances and privilege based upon those performances of like part of those performances of like whiteness and passing, but also just like the fact that you know like it's Andre 3000 that like performed with a shirt that said like across cultures darker people suffer most. Why? Like there's like a common theme in most like I think probably every continent that the darker you are, the worse your life will be, because white supremacy has been in every continent and has influenced every continent, right? So issues of like color and like themes of like darkness versus light, right? Like white is pure, dark is sin. Like this shit kind of goes back to like the whole creation of the Middle Ages of like our lexicon of like using colors and assigning and like coding those in racialized language. Probably stuff that was in the race relations lecture yesterday, right? Killer argument in a way that engages with the performance, and like all you need to do is watch the movie. And the fact that no one read that argument is probably the reason why no one actually engaged and actually watched the movie that they were talking about. You know? Because everyone's just like, oh, so like I can know what they're talking about, or I can just reframe. Like, if you understand where they're coming from, ask questions like, hey, who's Eve Ensler? Like, what's her story? Tell me more about her. Why'd she write this monologue? Or just like, hey, can you tell me about the history of the vagina monologues? Like, I don't know anything specific about Eve Ensler and the vagina monologues. It's problematic. You might be able to find something, but like, if you just engage and try and understand what they're talking about, and not just view debate as just like who can win and fight the other person better, debate's just debate, right? Any questions? That's dismissed.